So here we are in Quest for Truth. I believe this is, let me see what page it is. 112. And so go ahead, Marion, from I was
Okay, I'm not
en
gonna,
route.
okay, all right. All right. From I was. Oh. I was now, can you hear me all right?
Beautifully.
I was now en route for Hollywood, the one solution to a perfectly intractable situation. In fact, I began to think of suicide as the only alternative unless I could find my friend, for it was obvious I could not continue much longer as I was, with no friends and no money. As the big Greyhound bus sped quietly and smoothly along, endless, wide stretching roads, crisscrossing this immense and magnificent continent in which each state had its own characteristics, my thoughts harmonized in their dreariness with the depressing unsightliness of the flat Middle West where soil erosion had created. Great dust bowls, soil erosion created great dust bowls, a mute testimony to the rapacity of man. Apparently, in the whole of America, there were only a few big cities with character and personality of their own: New York, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and New Orleans. The latter because of its French heritage. And we must not forget Boston. Others, excepting for a few isolated portions with magnificent public buildings and colleges, seem to have grown up without design or imaginative planning of any kind. We saw unsightly processions of miscellaneous structures, unused, untidy plots of wasteland alongside presentable and unpresentable houses, petrol pump stations, and shops. Few parks or gardens or squares for the children to play in, or the aged or infirm to sit. But Virginia was a fascinating state, suggesting aristocratic lineage in its architecture. In the great American desert of Arizona, a sea in a former age, we caught glimpses of mysterious canyons and windswept mesas it is, windswept mesas. Prickly cacti with distorted shapes fringed the routes. One sensed the immensity of America, its huge distances. I felt engulfed by it all. A homeless stranger traversing an entire continent in search of a friend whose address I did not know. I had not heard of her for ages. She might be dead. Never can I forget the utter misery of it all. I might have been in the Sahara looking for water as looking for a friend in California. I wondered if the conquistadors had felt this isolation, they who had no roads or modern means of transport. Some of the Franciscan friars built their monasteries along the shores of the blue Pacific, the only artistic signs of Spanish culture left from former times, when life was leisurely and unhurried. We stopped at night at Memphis. How hideous and utterly unlike its namesake. And I'm passing.
And I guess that's the namesake is referring to Memphis, Egypt.
Yes, yes.
Gloria, could you unmute, please, and continue?
On the last lap of the journey, we reached El Paso. The money was getting less and less. I remember the warning of a dear old man who was temporarily on the bus. He had been born in England, so I told him my story. He gave me some food and told me on no account to mention to anybody that I had no money. My meals for weeks had been as scanty as I had dared to make them. The great need for the hour was how to make my money last till I reached my destination. But what would I do when I got there? It was imperative to have enough to stay in some lodging till I could find my old governess and friend Molly. I was appalled with my first impression of Los Angeles, the vulgarity of life, the great sprawling masses of endless mean habitations sprung up like mushrooms with no green settings, parks or planned constructions of any kind, all grown up in too great a hurry. While I did not expect to see Tudor castles, Gothic cathedrals, or Palladian bridges, or anything for that matter which pertained to old world charm, nevertheless, I did not expect to find such utter materialistic hideousness in the wealthiest and now the most influential nation on earth today. Certainly, it was the land of the almighty dollar. The bus drew into Hollywood Station in the morning, a lovely warm soft December morning. So here I was I, lonely and friendless, in the wickedest place in the world. The first thing I did was to go to the telephone booth in the station in order to look up Molly's address. It was not there, I froze. Could it be possible that after all she was dead? In my innocence, it had not occurred to me that the film world kept its addresses unpublished, and that in fact it would be about as difficult for a stranger to find a movie star as to find a needle in a haystack. I now had just $40 left. The problem was to find somewhere to lay my head. I walked over to the little rooming house opposite and was able to rent a room for a week, money payable in advance. The manager, a young man, looked at me with gimlet-like eyes that seemed to go right through me. Maybe odd characters would book rooms at this place. Wondering uneasily if he saw the secret of my poverty and abandonment, I looked searchingly into the mirror of my room to find one haggard face hardly recognizable. I was wearing a black coat and skirt, usually becoming to a fair skin, but in Hollywood, where men and women wore every color of the rainbow, the costume looked distinctly drab and dingy, heightened my generally forlorn appearance. I had never been interested in the movies, so few films worth seeing. Now I racked my brains to think of anybody I knew in that industry. I remembered that Laurence Olivier was a distant cousin, but I had never thought to meet him and now it was a bit late in the day to claim acquaintanceship. And poor relations were never popular. I did, however, write to a very famous star whose brother, also a film star, was a good friend of mine and who was fighting somewhere in France. My letter remained unanswered. It did not occur to me at that time that the secretary had probably consigned it to the waste paper basket, for don't know she was inundated with begging letters. There was now nothing to do but to walk from one studio to another to see if I could get some information of Molly's daughter, only to learn at last that she was acting in New York. This was the last straw, for no one would give me her address. I had even walked into a beauty parlor where they had her private phone number, but were not allowed to give it to anyone. I was now down to $25 with a room paid off for 1 week. Time was getting very precious. What did one do if one hadn't any money? I thought of the British consulate, but like the British embassy, which I visit in Washington, D.C., they could be very short of money themselves, and they must have plenty of other stranded English nationals on their hands. Also, I did not want the whole miserable story to come out. That would never do. At all costs, I must try to keep away. I was above all terrified of my plight getting into the papers. Meanwhile, in spite of my writing cheerful, optimistic letters home, my relations were getting worried and suspected that the real facts of the situation were being concealed. Also, I found, because of the war, that there was no way to get to Australia as I hoped. Being near to collapse, utterly sick and weary with frustration, I went to the police station. Surely they could find Molly for me? No. They knew nothing about the field people and were surprised that I should expect them to. They in no way resembled our dear fatherly English police. But one officer, more sympathetic than the others, kindly suggests that I should go to a tourist agency where trips can be taken to see the homes of the stars. And in this manner, I might be able to obtain the information I was seeking. But I have no money to spare for trips. I walk alone in despair and gazed into the windows of Hollywood's appetizing little restaurants on the famous boulevard. The odors of good cooking pervade my nostrils and made me hungrier than ever. To be starving and to have no money for food was indeed an adventure. Was that what Baba wanted? Had I not often wondered what it meant to be down and out, to belong to the dregs of society, though my plight was nothing compared with that of people who had, as refugees in Europe, lost everything, homes, farms, and possessions in flight before the advancing enemy. Still, I was sick with apprehension. I also had a curious pain in the solar plexus. Should I go to the Salvation Army? Were they not noted for their compassion? Unable to repress my hunger any longer, I entered a small, unpretentious restaurant and ordered some spaghetti. A kind, faded-looking woman was sitting opposite at my table. In my despair, I told her something of my trouble. She suggested that I should go to Amy Macpherson to the temple. It appeared that no genuine case was ever refused help her there. That was an idea. I could go next morning. Out on the streets again, we were confronted with placards, the Pearl Harbor bombing. So America would have to come into war after all, and England would be saved, provided she could carry on during the long years of preparation before America could put a force in the field. At that time, the States scarcely possessed any air force to speak of. We never saw a plane in the sky. My hopes rose. Perhaps now I might be able to obtain work of some kind, but what could I do? I have been brought up to be an ordinary social parasite. Then again, being slightly deaf and suffering always from eye strain, it will be difficult to get suitable employment. Also, an alien in America on a visit was not allowed to work. The next morning, while wondering whether to try the Salvation Army or the temple, to my astonishment and delight, I noticed the sign of the Red Cross, the British Red Cross. Entering the building, I asked to see the director. Oh yes, she knew my brother, Sir John Conybeare in London. Can I never forget the relief and joy at being personally identified, to be no longer a vagrant, an unknown, and perhaps unscrupulous adventuress. She also knew my friend Molly, who was working in another department. Heavens, it was all too good to be true. Molly was only a little farther up the boulevard. I would get there by taking the bus. She would be there. No need to phone. I took the bus. I could afford those few cents now. Going into the building, I asked for Mrs. A. She came. Molly, Irene. We embraced and I sank into a chair in a flood of tears. My reserve had completely broken down. We had not seen each other for over 10 years.
Thanks, Gloria. Miguel, could you take over, please?
Sure. To find Molly was like finding water in a desert. In considerably perturbations, she left her work and took me in her car back to her charming little house. All china, antique silver, all the familiar touches of an artistic English home. Before a fire, cup of tea in hand, I pour out the whole bitter story. Her gray curls shook with dismay, and her dark eyes were black with anger. How could I ever have got mixed up with such people? Now the question was, what to do next? Molly had no spare room, and though the most generous of people, her resources were small. She also had her financial troubles owing to the war. Now nobody knew what was going to happen with Japan in the war. Already people were leaving California and making for the east, for there was no reason whatever why the Japanese planes should not come over and bomb the country to pieces, since there was nothing to prevent them. I decided that the only thing I could do was to go into domestic service. The government could hardly object to my having a roof over my head. "Oh, my dear," exclaimed Molly, "you will never do it. You will never do it. Domestic service in America was a great deal harder work than in England. However, I insisted that I must find some kind of a light domestic job. After a month's wonderful rest, in which Molly gave me hints for cooking and how to behave like a good maid, we answered an advertisement in the papers. A family in Altadena wanted a mother's help. We drove over for the interview and were both delighted. An agreeable little house, nice and high near the mountains. The young couple had 3 children, and the mother was very tired and in need of quote-unquote help for the time being. I agreed to be paid $5 a week. I did not consider I was worth more than that, for I was still very run down and hoped for an easy situation. Since from the time I landed at New York, I had tried to economize on food and my constitution was weakened. Alas, in a few days, it looked as if I was not going to be a success. It was considered that I should be taking the children out for a walk in the afternoons, just when I wanted to lay on my bed, almost too exhausted to move. It seemed like I did not have, quote, a way with children, end quote. I certainly did not like the children. They were so cheeky and difficult. Anyway, American children are a byword, and I could see why.
Poor Irene.
And there is a asterisk at the very end. For that matter, one might say that the children of all Western civilizations suffer from want of poise and discipline. In India, I marveled at the obedience of children. Then again, owing to America's intervention in the war, the husband's financial affairs did not appear to be in good order. Money seemed very short, and I did not even get my wages. And the shortness showed itself too in the housekeeping. There was little to eat, and by the time the family had finished, there seemed nothing left for me. I felt they did not consider I was worth my keep and were probably starting to look for someone else. The position grew increasingly uncomfortable, and I was feeling utterly worn out. When I woke, I felt as if I was wading through a heavy sea. Such was the effort to keep going. Whatever will happen now if they got rid of me? I had nowhere to go and felt too ashamed to descend on poor Molly again after she had kept and fed me for over a month to get me into better condition. Then I remember my father's old friend whom I had managed to meet just before leaving New York, who had lent me $25. I did not by any means fully explain my predicament. Otherwise, I'm sure she would have lent me more, for I had given her the impression that I will be all right once I go to California. She had also given me a few introductions, and there was one to two people who lived nearby at Pasadena. So I wrote stating the difficulties of my position. The two ladies called almost immediately. Meanwhile, my employer wanted me to leave, for she had found a more suitable woman who, quote, understood children, end of quote. These good Samaritans came to the rescue, literally picked me up and transported me to a nice little hotel at Pasadena because their spare room was occupied. I was given a nice room with bathroom and everything I could need, all paid up a week in advance. And dollar bills were presented into my hands, which were to be spent on meals, and good meals at that, when I was not eating with them. I spent many happy hours at their beautiful place, reveling in the views and scenery. In the evening, there were myriad colored lights spread over the plain, but they told me they were nothing compared with peacetime illuminations. Yet it seemed a veritable fairyland of wonder and beauty at night. Meanwhile, Mrs. N, who was a person of much energy and good heart, had telephoned round to her friends and in a short time had raised a handsome subscription for the quote-unquote stranded English woman. Pouring the collection into my lap, she explained that there was now enough for me to be able to get away from the States, since I always had a passage booked on a boat for Cape Town, sailing the following April. I have to confess that, though grateful beyond words and much relief at the time, I felt ashamed and humiliated. It was as if the cup of mortification had been drunk to the dregs. So this was the way. I thought bitterly that Baba shared the devotees of their pride and arrogance.
Thanks, Miguel. Yeah, that's a priceless experience, being sheared of pride and arrogance. England was now receiving punishment for her Victorian prosperity. Her pride and complacency were being crushed. And I, as an individual, was getting my share. Light enough when compared with what the folks at home were suffering. For had not London been bombed 67 nights consecutively? Wow, every night for 2 months. The city of London, the clearinghouse of the world, was now a charred mess. But all that did not make my plight as a recipient of charity any better. I remembered Baba's mischievous smile at Ajmer and how uncomfortable he had made me feel. It seemed at the time that he was saying, "You will have a hard time of it, my girl, if you follow me." Then the worst happened. The boat that I hoped would take me back to Cape Town was commandeered by the government. So there was no longer any question of being able to get away. I just had to stay where I was. Back again to poor Molly. There was a rest of about 2 months. Then it was decided that I should go to work again, this time as a domestic servant, since I had been found wanting as a mother's help. Without telling Molly, who was always against my trying domestic service, I searched the advertisements and found a situation that seemed promising and went and got myself engaged on approval for the time being. The little house is modern with every convenience. The husband had a little market and the wife worked in a big store in Los Angeles. There were 2 school children, so that I did have the place to myself for most of the day. It was not a happy family, for the mother and son did not get along together. He suffered from arrested development. Although 18 years old, he was in some way more like a child of 14. However, we got along well together, except when he came back from school with such information as, quote, "They say the British are cowards," end quote, etc. Because of the continuous upheavals in the house, I suggested that the boy should go to a psychiatrist. Unfortunately, the psychiatrist had a close association with Freud and made the boy much worse by telling him his defects were the fault of his parents. I know a lot of people like that. Sometimes when I was bending over the stove preparing the evening meal, I had to duck to avoid utensils flying over my head. So violently did the family quarrel at times. One night, the police were called in to stop a dispute. This decided me to try and get away. Although I had been engaged at $30 a month, I simply could not cope with the family washing for 4. So they beat me down to $20 a month, so that I was getting less than in my last place. During those uneasy months, I stayed 6 in all. I would talk to Baba mentally. I asked him to find me a more suitable place, and I visualized in my mind a cultured old American lady who had been in Europe and whose house would have Persian rugs and old masters and all the signs of European culture. I wanted also a nice garden and a good view. It was about this time that I received $200 indirectly from Baba and was able to leave and go back to Mali. For now, I could have a few weeks rest and search for a more suitable situation. So we don't know how it indirectly came from Baba. Irene's not telling us. Molly studied the advertisements. There was one from a lady who needed a housekeeper. We drove round to the address. Curiously enough, this lovely place was only 15 minutes walk from my last place. A charming house on a ridge with a beautiful view of the range of mountains and the Mount Wilson Observatory. The garden was laid out in a formal Italian style. A lovely and elegant old lady opened the door. The house had Persian rugs, lovely antique furniture, which would be a pleasure to dust. And Della Robbias and old masters were on the walls. Thank you, Baba. I could not have seen myself in a more perfect setting. The telephone was going incessantly, and my prospective employer had already received 75 applications for the post. What chance had I? Molly and I sat down and I was interviewed. She told me she lived alone. And could I look after the house and could I cook? I replied honestly, no, but I can try. The end of the story is that she engaged me, obviously because she was sorry for me and liked the British. Her last mate had been with her 12 years and had left to make more money in a war factory. I cannot describe my happiness and how kind she was, and what a relief it was to find myself with a cultured person. For so many American houses look more like club rooms, devoid of charm or personality. The mere idea of living in any of them had depressed me. I feel sure on this occasion that Baba had heard my call. I stayed with her for a long time and then went up to San Francisco, as I wished to see something of America before I left. And she had the gardener's wife to look after her and really did not need me. She packed a luncheon basket for me, and when I opened it on the train, there was a note. Quote, "If they don't treat you right, come back to mom," end quote. I was allowed to keep her home as my headquarters, but naturally not wishing to sponge too much on her generosity, I would take jobs from time to time, for none knew when the war would end. It was imperative to make a little money to send food to England. We will now draw a veil over my experiences as a domestic servant, euphemistically called housekeeper. Some were happy, others were not. Fortunately, I did have a flair for cooking, and this really saved the situation, as I did not make a very good maid. How much I learned in those days, how much more capable and adaptable I had become. Got to say that again. How much I learned in those days, how much more capable and adaptable I had become. But due to the spinal trouble and my weak back from time to time, I would collapse. However, some helping hand always came to the rescue, and in my most desperate moments, the clouds would turn to sunshine. Marion, could you unmute and continue, please?
All right. From the experiences, From the experiences of others closely associated with Meher Baba, it appears that no matter how much a close follower is made to suffer from uncertainty, suspense, and lack of security, the water, as the Indian saying goes, may reach the level of the chin, but would never rise above the nose. So I had never known what it meant to have no bank balance. And for the first time, I was learning how the other half lived. I had often wondered how monthly and weekly wage earners felt the sense of precariousness that must haunt all those with responsibilities. To be a servant was to be a machine, a help, must never be ill, always cheerful and happy under no matter what circumstances, a lack of it all trades, a jack of all trades. I now fully understand why it was always so difficult to get servants in England. For the girls no longer went into domestic service, for one never finished, and working in a factory, one had fixed hours and liberty after the work was done. My attitude towards life was now different. I understood better the problem of labor and management, that workers should not be treated like cogs in a machine. The whole trouble with industrial relations all over the world is the lack of sympathetic outlook, where the extension of group control holds sway. Again, we need spiritual values as in everything else. I also learned a few things about Hollywood, the happy hunting ground of playboys and exhibitionists, empty-headed women who seemed to have nothing to think about except their looks and their promiscuous sex relations. The fact that such women can command high prices for their memoirs only shows the deplorable low standards of journalism and the appalling taste of the general public. In India, I was much struck by the high quality and standards of Indian journalism as compared with the cheap, sensational press of the Western world. While there are always great souls to be found in the film industry, the majority appear to think of nothing but careers and box office receipts. The marvelous possibilities for educational and cultural influences appear to have been sacrificed for a base commercialization in which all true values and ideals have become completely destroyed. I was indeed pleased to find later that in India, a good British film could command a packed house, whereas the average cheap American production was practically ignored, which suggests that the average Indian mind is more adult than that of the Westerner. Looking back on the 4 years that I was stranded in America without funds, I can realize what a most valuable education I underwent, for I found a new set of values and a fresh sympathy and understanding. I do not think I can close this personal narrative without mentioning Mrs. Roosevelt's great kindness of heart. It was not till 1942, when happily settled at Los Angeles, that I wrote to her, explaining my circumstances, and that I was well and happy. But I did hope that I might meet some university people before leaving the States, for at that time I had no social intercourse except with the milkman and the baker. Unknown to me, Mrs. Roosevelt was at that time on a visit to Los Angeles, but her secretary, who must have received at least 2,000 letters a day at the White House, contrived to pick mine out and send it direct to her. However, she was just leaving when she received it, so wrote to say that she would put me in touch with someone, and a few days later, I received a most courteous letter from the president of one of the colleges asking if he might call on me. Being a bit shy in my apron and cap, and at the thought of perhaps having to entertain him in the kitchen, I arranged to go to him instead. We found we had had mutual friends, and as I was telling him my experiences, I noted that he was writing down everything I said. On asking why, he explained that, quote, Mrs. Roosevelt wanted to know all about it. Close.
Thanks, Marianne. Gloria, continue, please.
Several people were most kind, and especially Mr. Aldous Huxley, who, on hearing I was stranded, immediately sent me a very big check, which fortunately I was able to repay fairly soon after. As my phone unexpectedly turned up at last, the Bank of England suddenly deciding to release some money for me. At various stages while stranded in the United States, I had proof of Baba's loving care. When in Washington and not able to see Mrs. Roosevelt, I had sent a despairing telegram to India, and 2 days later, when sitting disconsolate on the divan bed of my room with my back to the window, suddenly I felt what seemed to be warm pulsating rays of sunshine striking my back. Turning round, I saw the sky was overcast. Then I realized that Baba must have got the cable. It was something later that he arranged for me to have some money. And as I have related, it came at a critical time, enabling me to leave that most unsuitable situation and take a rest. On several occasions, I have been told by people with clairvoyant faculties that they saw a great Indian master standing behind me. Also, from time to time, I would unexpectedly sense his influence in a feeling of all-encompassing love, as if he were near me. It's impossible to describe the ebb and flow of that love, but all those close to Baba feel and know it at times. And looking back, I can see that I was being watched over and protected. The remarkable thing is that in 1945, just after receiving funds from England, my health broke down completely and serious spinal trouble developed. In fact, it looked as if I might never walk again, for the middle vertebrae had become so porous that there was danger of the spine breaking in two. There was consultation about removing bone from one of my shins to bolster up the vertebrae. I decided to write to Baba, explaining the situation, but had no reply. But sometime later, I had an extremely vivid dream in which I saw Baba standing before me. He was all in white. I fell on my knees and hid my head in his robes. You will recover, he said. I was so cheered by this dream that later I asked my surgeon if he believed in miracles. He replied that in the course of his profession, he had not come across any, to which I answered, well, between quotes, well, believe me or not, I shall soon be walking as well as ever, end quote. Fortunately, my husband was able to come out for 6 months, but could not stay longer owing to currency restrictions, so was obliged to leave me in a sanatorium, where I made a complete recovery. The next time the x-rays were taken, some months later, all trace of the disease in the pelvis, spine, and elsewhere had disappeared, and I was able to walk as well as before. Before concluding this chapter, let me mention one remarkable incident. It was in October 1941 in New York that I woke up one morning with a voice speaking in my ear. It said, quote, remember, when you wake up, that Baba will speak on November 11th, end quote. I was, however, not told what year. I can give no explanation for this, except that I heard later on that the number 11 plays an important part in numerology and is said by some to be a master number. Somehow, I think it was the same voice that had startled me in 1934 when it said, quote, this is no reality, end quote. It is worth remembering that interesting fact, namely that the First World War ended in England on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of the year.
Thanks, Gloria. Miguel, please.
Chapter 9, Homewards. It was now 1947, and I was strong enough to leave America and return home. However, my husband suggested that we should meet in Australia as he wanted change from the long war years in England. As the plane soared into the evening sky, winging its way to the other side of the world, I watched the twinkling lights of Los Angeles. As they fade out, I felt an overwhelming sense of loneliness. I was leaving so many good friends, and I had grown to love America. Was she not the hope of the new age to come? For she was not hindered by the hampering traditions of the old world. Also, presumably because of her mixed parentage, she has such dynamic and tremendous vitality. How Americans work, how they get things done. It is work, not the resources, that has made America such a great nation in so short a time. The people are not tired, as in so many other countries, ravaged by constant wars. What I appreciated was the dignity of labor and the absence of class snobbishness. I was in the States for nearly 7 years, and I do not remember having seen any beggars. The American social system has proved the hollowness of the Marxian theory, that high industrialism is always a case of the rich grinding the faces of the poor. America has achieved the remarkable feat of amalgamating different European races into a unity of language, country, and economy without internal barriers, except in the southern states, which for economic reasons still try to keep the American Negro in subjection. But that also is changing. One thing that saddened me was that I quite often had to fight Britain's battles. It seemed petty in view of the fact that she was at the time fighting as usual with her back to the wall. In the First World War, America did not come in till 1917, the very end. In the Second World War, she was also very tardy. Would she have come in now at all, if not been for the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor? I was frankly astonished at the part that historic memory still plays in the States. that is to say, the errors of George III. It is the American history textbook that causes the mischief. The British look upon their own history as a valuable contribution towards the liberty of the individual, and this makes it a little difficult to understand the American mentality. But just because we speak a common language, it does not mean we have common interests. On the contrary, they often conflict. The rapid decline of Western civilization in America causes gloomy forebodings. One has only to read the views of Lippmann, Sorokin, Tony V, and Angeli. How can it be otherwise in our present unregenerated state? Democracy, even at its best, contains the seed of its own destruction. Do not the records of history show that the collapse of civilization is due to lack of moral values caused by too much pursuit of easy and pleasure? I was not long in Australia to find that life there will be altogether too difficult. The question of accommodation was quite hopeless. The country was very much congested. Refugees had poured in through its hospitable gates, but not so hospitable after all, as some of these unfortunate people later found out, there being so merciless legislation whereby refugees were compelled to do manual labor for the first 2 years of their stay. There was no proper discrimination in this matter. I heard some shocking tales. One of the Hungarian pianists who was condemned to go to Alice, an out of the way spot in Central Australia, where he was put to work with a pig's eggs, and his hands were irretrievably ruined for his profession as a musician. Later, when in Tasmania, I tried to help a Bulgarian professor of philosophy from Belgrade, who was made to work in a flour mill and injured his back carrying heavy flour bags. He was small and delicate. He was scandalously treated, for one would have thought his knowledge of Russian might have been of some considerable use in Australia, but he was condemned to be in Navy instead. I heard many heartbreaking stories from other refugees. In Sydney, it was impossible to stay in a hotel for more than 3 weeks. Then one had to move somewhere else, a kind of general pause going on. So I was obliged to postpone my husband's arrival.
So a navvy is an unskilled laborer.
Mhm.
Thanks, Miguel. This is a good place to stop. At the top of page 135.